From New York, the U.S. epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, this is Democracy Now!
We all together have done a very good job, but 2.2 up to 2.2 million deaths and maybe even beyond that, I'm feeling very good about what we did last week.
Been described as the public health failure of the century. As the United States leads the world in coronavirus infections, a record number of Americans file for unemployment. Gasping for air, gasping for care. What does global health justice look like? We'll speak with two Yale professors who say decades of neoliberal austerity make it harder to fight the pandemic. They propose a new deal for public health. Then, more than 100 million people across the United States have been ordered to stay home to prevent the spread of the virus. But what about people who are homeless?
The bathroom situation. Now, Starbucks was a big hub for homeless people to use the bathroom. So how are they washing their hands? The mall is closed. No bathroom. And there's a 24-hour bread and butter, but they're not letting people use the bathroom. So how are people supposed to wash their hands?
We'll look at the homeless people in New York City shelters and on the streets who've been left with no way to safely shelter in place. Then to Oakland and Los Angeles, where a group of unhoused mothers, elders, and families have reclaimed vacant homes to stay safe during the pandemic.
We want all these houses to be occupied by human beings now, immediately.
Right on.
Vacant houses, especially now with the coronavirus. It is really a safety hazard to have all these people on the streets while there's empty houses. They're state-owned, and they're empty. So we're not doing anything wrong.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic is nearing 35,000, as confirmed cases have now risen to over 730,000 around the world. The United States continues to lead in coronavirus cases with over 143,000 known infections, though the true number is certain to be far higher due to lack of access to tests. There are over 2,500 deaths. On Sunday, President Trump walked back earlier statements about lifting social distancing advisories by Easter, instead extending the government guidelines through the end of April. He said the peak death rate is likely 2 weeks from now. Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, warned coronavirus could kill up to 200,000 Americans, but that any estimate was still a moving target. Trump addressed the possible U.S. death toll while speaking at his Sunday news briefing.
So you're talking about 2.2 million deaths, 2.2 million people from this. And so if we could hold that down, as we're saying, to 100,000, it's a horrible number. Maybe even less, but to 100,000. So we have between 100 and 200,000. We all together have done a very good job.
The 2.2 million figure comes from one projection if no measures were put in place to slow down the spread of the virus. Trump also boasted about his TV ratings at his news briefings, comparing them to Monday Night Football, said he was beating it, and attacked PBS News reporter Yamiche Alcindor.
You've said repeatedly that you think that some of the equipment that governors are requesting, they don't actually need. You said New York might not need 30,000. You said it on Sean Hannity's Fox News. You said
that
why
don't you people act? Let me ask you.
You said
why don't you act in a little more positive? It's always trying to
get you. My question to you is,
get you. And you know what? That's why nobody trusts the media anymore.
My question to you is, how is that going to impact?
Excuse me, you didn't hear me. That's why you used to work for the Times and now you work for somebody else. Look, let me tell you something. Be nice. Don't
Mr.
be
President,
threatening.
my question is...
Don't be threatening.
As states continue to issue dire warnings about the severe lack of medical equipment, Trump ordered General Motors Friday to produce 40,000 ventilators under the Defense Production Act. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued new travel advisories for New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, urging people to refrain from non-essential domestic travel. Trump previously said he would impose a quarantine on the tri-state area, which some state officials said was not in his purview. He walked that threat back. Some states are taking their own measures to stop new cases of the coronavirus from traveling across state lines. Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo, who said on Sunday it will require all out-of-state visitors to self-quarantine when entering Rhode Island. On Friday, she initially applied the order to just New Yorkers. Florida recently unveiled new measures to combat the spread of the coronavirus after coming under criticism for not shutting down beaches during spring break, including an interstate highway checkpoint and requirements that travelers from New York and New Orleans self-quarantine for 2 weeks. The Florida governor said it's pleased deploying the National Guard members to intercept travelers from New York City area at airports. Governor Ron DeSantis also said the state would suspend vacation rentals for 2 weeks. In other news from Florida, a reporter for the Miami Herald and the Tampa Bay Times says DeSantis blocked her from entering a news briefing after she requested the office allow for social distancing between reporters and video press briefings to protect the journalists. In Washington state, the American Academy of Emergency Medicine condemned the removal of a Bellingham ER doctor who publicly called out his hospital's lack of protection for workers. Earlier this month, Dr. Ming Lin posted on Facebook that Peace Health St. Joseph Medical Center was not following appropriate testing protocols and exposing healthcare workers and patients to unnecessary risks. Coronavirus cases have been mounting across prison populations, with hundreds of confirmed COVID-19 cases among prisoners and staff in multiple jails in New York, Chicago, and around the country. New York Police Commissioner Dermot Shea said he expects coronavirus cases among police officers to reach 900 today. Nearly 14% of the New York police force was out sick Sunday, according to the commissioner. Around 700 New Jersey police officers have tested positive for the coronavirus, and 400 Detroit police officers are now in quarantine. The Detroit Police Commissioner has tested positive for COVID. In Philadelphia, city officials have ended talks with the owner of what was once the Hahnemann University Hospital, which shut down last year after being purchased by a private equity firm. The owner of the property told Philadelphia to either buy the hospital, which has room for nearly 500 beds, or pay nearly $1 million per month to lease it. In Illinois, a 9-month-old died after contracting COVID-19, the first known infant death from the coronavirus in the United States. In healthcare news, President Trump said Cigna and Humana are waiving copays for coronavirus treatment, but some healthcare experts say insurance companies are set to make huge profits from the virus crisis, in part by hiking up premiums next year. CBS News announced Emmy Award-winning producer, CBS News executive Maria Mercader died from coronavirus. She was 54 years old and had survived cancer, which she battled for over 2 decades. New York remains the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in the United States, with more than 1,000 deaths and over 60,000 cases statewide, over half of those here in New York City. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio said Sunday residents who do not adhere to strict social distancing rules can be fined up to $500 as the city scrambles to stem a surge in new cases. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said Friday New York will build 8 temporary hospitals. Tents started going up in Central Park over the weekend, and an emergency field hospital is expected to be open on Tuesday to start caring for overflow patients from nearby Mount Sinai West Hospital. Nurses from Jacobi Hospital in the Bronx held a demonstration to protest the lack of personal protective equipment, or PPE, as they face a spike in coronavirus cases. This is emergency room nurse Kelly Cabrera.
This moment is for all of us right now on the front lines to come together to show the world that we are real people taking care of real people. We're here to show the federal government that we exist. And yes, we are here in protest of the fact that they have the capabilities and the resources to help us, and they sadly have chosen not to do so.
See our interview with Kelly Cabrera and pediatric emergency nurse Sean Petty at DemocracyNow.org. Nurses across the country, including Georgia, Illinois, and California, have staged similar protests in recent days. On Sunday, Trump accused hospitals of hoarding ventilators and questioned why masks are disappearing from hospitals in New York. Unproven accusations that he made. In more news from New York, Governor Cuomo released an executive order Saturday saying hospitals cannot force pregnant people to give birth without a chosen support person. The order comes in response to a move by New York Presbyterian and Mount Sinai hospital systems to bar partners from labor and delivery rooms, causing widespread outrage. New York became the latest state to postpone its presidential primary, originally scheduled for next month, to June 23rd, the same date as state legislative and congressional elections. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom says his state received 170 broken ventilators from a national stockpile, but that a Silicon Valley company is working to fix them. California cases have topped 6,000 with over 130 deaths. In more news from California, the mayor of Lancaster has said a teenager who's believed to have died from COVID-19 last week was turned away from an urgent care clinic because he did not have health insurance. He had a heart attack on the way to the hospital. President Trump signed the record-breaking $2.2 trillion coronavirus stimulus package into law Friday after the House of Representatives passed the massive bill earlier in the day. On the House floor, New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez blasted the bill's $500 billion corporate bailout.
We have to go into this vote eyes wide open. What did the Senate majority fight for? One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history. Shameful. The greed of that fight is wrong for crumbs, for our families. And the option that we have is to either let them suffer with nothing or to allow this greed and billions of dollars, which will be leveraged into trillions of dollars, to contribute to the largest income inequality gap in our future.
President Trump said he will not adhere to oversight provisions for the corporate bailout and that his administration will not provide documentation to audit the money. Millions of undocumented workers have been left out of the government stimulus plan as they face some of the highest rates of job loss. Immigrant rights groups are also warning Trump's so-called public charge rule, which allows officials to deny green cards and visas to immigrants who use public benefits, has left some too scared to seek medical help. Dozens of immigrants at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington, have been on hunger strike since Friday to protest their continued imprisonment at the for-profit facility owned by Geo Group. This is a striking immigrant prisoner.
We're just asking for deportations to be postponed while the pandemic passes. We are not asking for anything more. I think we are human. We are not animals to be treated as the worst thing in this country. We are asking for a humanitarian visa.
In other immigration news, a federal judge in Los Angeles has urged the government to work to release imprisoned immigrant children amidst the worsening coronavirus pandemic. In labor news, workers for grocery delivery app Instacart are going on strike today to demand the company implement appropriate safety measures and give them hazard pay. Amazon workers in Staten Island, New York, are walking off the job today, accusing Amazon of continuing to work out of the warehouse despite multiple co-workers testing positive for COVID-19. Workers are demanding Amazon close and sanitize the fulfillment warehouse before they return to work. On Tuesday, Whole Foods workers are calling for a sick-out to demand hazard pay, guaranteed paid time off for workers who self-quarantine, and health care coverage for part-time and seasonal workers. In Europe, Italy's death toll is nearing 11,000 as the country approaches 100,000 COVID-19 cases. Meanwhile, Spain reported nearly 840 new coronavirus deaths Sunday, its highest daily increase as its death toll tops 7,300. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced Saturday all non-essential workers must remain at home for the next 2 weeks as the government ramps up measures to contain the pandemic that has pushed hospitals and morgues to the brink. France, Italy, and Spain, three of the hardest-hit countries in Europe, are calling on the European Union to do more to help combat the coronavirus, including providing funds to help finance the country's response to the pandemic. This is Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez.
La respuesta no puede ser solamente nacional en consecuencia.
The response cannot only be national. It must be a European response. It has to be a response where we all row as one, whether we are Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, or German. It has to be a European response.
Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte warned nationalist instincts could gain strength if the European Union fails to act. In Britain, officials say the nation could be under some type of lockdown for 6 months or more. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, one of nearly 20,000 known coronavirus patients in Britain, he tested positive for COVID-19. Over 1,200 people have died. In Russia, Moscow is starting a lockdown today affecting nearly 13 million residents. Over 1,000 infections have been reported in the Russian capital. Meanwhile, in Belarus, authoritarian President Alexander Lukashenko's response to the pandemic is in stark contrast to other European leaders as he refused to implement any protective measures and advised citizens of Belarus to drink vodka and visit the sauna to combat the infection. In Japan, the popular comedian Ken Shimura has died after contracting COVID-19 at the age of 70. Known for his slapstick style, he was a regular fixture on Japanese variety shows. His death comes as the Japanese government has resisted imposing a lockdown or social distancing measures, citing concerns for the economy. Japan recorded over 170 new cases Sunday, 68 of those in Tokyo. Testing has remained extremely limited. In the Philippines, law enforcement officers have reportedly been subjecting people who violate the national lockdown to violent punishment, including locking them in crowded dog cages. In the Middle East, the first coronavirus death in Syria was reported Sunday, 1 week after it announced its first confirmed case. Saudi officials say they shot down ballistic missiles fired at Riyadh and along the southern border with Yemen days after warring parties in Yemen agreed to a nationwide ceasefire amidst the coronavirus pandemic. An outbreak in Yemen would have catastrophic effects in the war-torn country, which is already home to the world's worst humanitarian crisis thanks to the U.S.-supported Saudi-led war, which has decimated the healthcare system. Meanwhile, as fighting escalates in Libya between the so-called Libyan National Army and the United Nations-backed government, officials say there are now 8 confirmed cases. Libya says it's freeing around 450 prisoners as part of the effort to stem the spread of the virus. In Brazil, as President Jair Bolsonaro continues to downplay the coronavirus pandemic, governors across the country have decided to promote social distancing and other measures among their constituents. Meanwhile, press freedom groups are denouncing Bolsonaro's recent approval of a provisional regulation restricting access to public records, including information about how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting Brazil. In Central America, Guatemalan officials have confirmed a man who was deported from the U.S. last week has tested positive for COVID-19. In Panama, at least 4 people died and 2 others have tested positive aboard a Dutch-owned cruise ship anchored near Panama City. A UN body says the African continent is 2 to 3 weeks away from its peak of coronavirus cases and needs an emergency economic stimulus of $100 billion to ensure its healthcare systems can cope with the oncoming onslaught. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, has ordered residents of Lagos and Abuja to stay at home. Nigeria has registered over 100 cases, but testing remains very limited. In Kenya, security forces in Mombasa deployed tear gas and hit crowds with batons as they tried to board a passenger ferry ahead of a 7 p.m. curfew. In South Africa, police and military forces fired rubber bullets at shoppers gathered outside a Johannes supermarket amidst a nationwide lockdown. Nearly 1,300 cases have been recorded in South Africa, the highest number on the African continent. In Iraq, U.S. coalition forces withdrew Sunday from a third base as the military continues to consolidate its troops following attacks earlier this month. The K-1 military base is the site of a December rocket attack that killed an American contractor and triggered a series of retaliatory attacks between U.S. forces and Iranian-backed militias, and the Trump-ordered assassination of Iran's top military commander, Qasem Soleimani. And Reverend Joseph Lowery, the civil rights pioneer and co-founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, died Friday at the age of 98. He died of natural causes. Reverend Lowery worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. until King's assassination in 1968. Lowery organized the boycott of segregated buses in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. He delivered protesters' demands to George Wallace, the state's segregationist governor, at the 1965 March for Voting Rights from Selma to Montgomery. In 2006, at the funeral for Coretta Scott King, Reverend Lowery blasted President George W. Bush over the Iraq War and his conservative agenda, even as Bush sat in the front row. Reverend Lowery was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2009 by President Barack Obama. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It's been described as the public health failure of the century. As the global death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic tops 34,000, with 723,000 confirmed cases, the United States continues to lead in coronavirus cases with over 143,000 known infections, though the true number is certain to be much higher because of the extreme lack of testing. The U.S. is now reporting nearly 2,600 deaths after receiving widespread condemnation for downplaying the threat of the virus. On Sunday, President Trump reversed course on lifting social distancing advisories by Easter and extended the government guidelines through the end of April. This comes after he signed the record-breaking $2 trillion coronavirus bill into law Friday that's been condemned by critics for including corporate slush funds, and a record 3.3 million Americans have filed for unemployment. On Friday, the head of the International Federation of Red Cross warned social unrest could erupt among people who live in poverty and now lack resources of income and the COVID-19 crisis.
We have a lot of people who is living very marginalized. Let me use a word in the so-called of the black hole of the society, no, with the daily jobs or other way to live. And in the most difficult neighborhoods of the biggest city, I'm afraid that in few weeks we will have social problems. This is a social bomb that can explode in every moment because they don't have any way to have an income or to find an income.
When we come back, we'll be joined by a Yale epidemiologist and law professor who are proposing a new deal for public health. Stay with us. That's the Toronto Symphony playing Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring from their homes. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The global death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic nearing 35,000, and the confirmed cases nearing 750,000 around the world. We're joined now by two Yale professors who co-authored a piece for the Boston Review headlined "Alone Against the Virus," in which they argue decades of neoliberal austerity will make it harder to fight the coronavirus pandemic. They write, "At every step, a rapaciously profit-driven healthcare system and an austerity-ravaged state will make this virus harder to manage. Inequality is itself associated with poorer health outcomes, including lower life expectancies across nations. The coronavirus is about to illustrate that epidemics are great levelers. They can collapse social classes, even if, as with all forms of collapse, the people at the bottom get the worst of it." They go on to write, "The question today is whether we can learn something from coronavirus that might not only help us mitigate the harm of this pandemic, but build a new infrastructure of care that allows us to better protect the most vulnerable and us all." With us now to discuss their article and their argument is Greg Gonsalves, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology of Microbial Diseases at Yale School of Public Health, co-director of the Global Health Justice Partnership, and Amy Kapczynski, Professor of Law at Yale Law School, co-founder of the Law and Political Economy blog, co-director of the Global Health Justice Partnership. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! If you can talk about how this pandemic has really applied a microscope to health injustice, not only in this country, but in the world. Amy Kapczynski, why don't you begin?
Thanks so much. So there are many ways in which the coronavirus pandemic is really revealing the kind of inner logic of our system, right? And so one piece of it is think about how our healthcare system is structured. Right? So, the fact that people faced the question of whether they could afford testing or whether they can afford to go in and get treatment. For example, maybe a logical place to go would be to your doctor, but people don't have doctors that they can go to, right? All of those kinds of features of our profit-driven healthcare system, along with the underfunding of the infrastructure that we need to respond to this. For example, do we have enough hospital beds? Do we have the kind of resources given to our public health experts that can really allow them to respond? All of those kinds of things are going to make this pandemic far worse than it needed to be. Another really important piece of this is our carceral state. Right? The United States is extraordinarily extreme in the degree to which we put people in prison, and we use kind of carceral punitive measures to address questions of migration. This epidemic is going to spread like wildfire in prisons. We know that prisons are drivers of epidemics, and we know that all of those who are being held in immigration detention are at really grave risk. And those kinds of things, the fact that we have approached the other people in our society with this kind of punitive carceral approach, and it's going to mean that the epidemic is going to be extraordinarily hard to control in those places. And because we're all connected, it becomes harder to control elsewhere.
Greg Gonsalves, if you can talk about the failure of the response, the astounding fact that President Trump keeps boasting that he applied a very early travel ban, and yet even with this early travel ban, did not push for the access to tests, which are perhaps the #1 public health measure to prevent the spread, and also the protective gear to the heroes and heroines of the United States, the medical professionals all over this country who are the hardest hit right now.
Sure. So as you mentioned, this is the public health failure, not this century, but probably the past 100 years, back to the 1918 Great Influenza epidemic that swept across the globe. We knew in December that this was going to be a global pandemic. It was a coronavirus like SARS, which swept over the world, and we had 3 months to prepare. There were reports internally circulating in D.C., let's say early January, to give us a little bit of more breathing room for the public health response, but the government sat on its hands. First, it said, we're not going to use the WHO, World Health Organization test, we're going to make our own. And of course, it ran into problems in the implementation of that test and had to start from scratch. So we got 3 months into the pandemic with no real public health response from our national governments. Then we've had this sort of contradictory set of pronouncements from the White House. The president underplays the seriousness of the epidemic, while scientists like Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, says we could see 200,000 deaths in this country. So we've had sort of a collapse of leadership from the CDC all the way up to the White House, in which we were caught, frankly, with our pants down for a pandemic that was obviously sweeping the world. As early as January, we could have anticipated this and acted.
So now, as we move forward, Professor Gonsalves, from an epidemiological perspective, how do the neoliberal policies of the United States, and define that term neoliberal, the kind of private healthcare system we have, how does it contribute to, accelerate the pandemic in this country?
Well, I'd let Amy define neoliberalism, but I think what we see here is that even in the wake of the Affordable Care Act, we still have millions of people uninsured in this country, of people underinsured. As Amy also suggested, we have a whole class of people are outside of our circle of care: undocumented immigrants, prisoners, the homeless. And in order to sort of contain this epidemic, we need to know through testing where it is and to what extent, but we also have to be able to get people into care to be treated and taken care of, to be able to give them the resources they need to do social distancing. Social distancing is our main public health tool against this virus. And unlike other countries in Europe, such as Denmark, which is providing 80% of salary support to people in order to let them be able to stay home, and a whole set of other social services we don't give in this country to our populace, we're going to make it very, very difficult for people to prevent the disease from spreading in their communities. And if this is what neoliberalism is, dog eat dog, every man and woman for himself, then maybe that's a good definition for what it is, and it's not, it's hazardous to your health.
Professor Gonsalves, you go back with Dr. Fauci way back to the years of massive AIDS activism. He was the leading figure during the Reagan years around AIDS. Can you talk about your relationship with him and his approach to this pandemic? Trace the trajectory from AIDS to what we're seeing now.
Well, Dr. Fauci, yes, has seen the AIDS epidemic. He's seen Ebola. He's seen H1N1, SARS. He's been on the front line of all these epidemics. And, early relationships with him were contentious, protested against him, locked horns with him many times in the late 80s, early 90s.
You were part of ACT UP.
I was part of ACT UP. But what's clear over the past decade or more is that he's turned out to be a very trustworthy, science-based, evidence-based figure for helping the United States understand how to respond to infectious disease, such as during the Ebola crisis when he hugged a nurse who had been treated for Ebola at the National Institute of Health. He's been the one person on the podium at the White House who has been able to sort of speak truth to power and say what the facts are rather than what the spin is coming out of the vice president, the president, Ambassador Birx, Surgeon General Adams, and the rest.
Amy Kapczynski, so I'm going to leave it to you to define these neoliberal policies that you have said have worsened and this pandemic and the effect of it in the United States, and to lay out what our system is today. Now, insurance companies that say they will not only not charge for testing but not charge for treatment are called heroes in a private system, but afterwards will immediately increase people's insurance costs. What is a New Deal for public health? But begin on the issue of neoliberal policies.
Sure. So neoliberalism is commonly defined by scholars as a kind of political movement that, in fact, sought to change the relationship between effectively kind of the market and democracy. So people often think of it as coming to prominence in the 1980s and the 1990s. Think of the Reagan and Thatcher programs and the Washington Consensus as key pillars of neoliberal policy approaches. So they demand, for example, deregulation, the starving of the state, the expansion of the profit motive to more and more parts of society, and the organization of more and more parts of society according to market logic, right? So deregulation, privatization, and the priority given to markets over society and over people. So with that sort of in mind, I think it's pretty clear to see how we have built not only a healthcare system, but also a system of work, for example, right, where there's no sick pay for so many millions of Americans. They can't stay home when they're sick. That's driven by a profit logic, right? That's driven by an extractive idea about how business should relate to human beings. And it's one that undermines the health of all of us, right? Because if people, as everyone's become really aware of at this moment, if people can't stay home when they're sick, then none of us can be protected from things like the coronavirus, right? And many things beyond that. So that kind of profit logic, the same sort of logic that starved the state, right? That has, one of the things we should talk about in our piece is the way that public health has been underfunded. Right? And the way that, Donald Trump is like the apotheosis of this, right? He says at some point in one of these early press conferences that he didn't want a lot of people sitting around preparing for epidemics because, that was kind of wasted overhead. Right? I mean, that kind of logic is what leaves us unprepared to deal with these deep structural vulnerabilities and to deal with crisis. And that's really where we're at. We don't have the resources to hand. We don't have the institutions that we need to get care and money to people quickly. And we don't have ways to support people to do what our society needs us all to do right now, which is to stay home and take care of one another by staying home and engaging in social distancing. So what does a new system look like? Well, one of the key pillars, I think, of a New Deal for public health, as Greg and I see it, is, of course, something like Medicare for all. Right? So that we need people to be able to access care in this country without concern that they're going to go bankrupt, right? Which is what so many people face today. And we need to extend the circle of care to everyone so that we're all protected and so that we can all then be connected in this circle of care. So beyond that, of course, there are things like sick pay and rights for workers. I think you're going to see that places that give workers rights are going to deal better and they're going to contribute more to our public than places that treat them as disposable. So we need more power for workers. We need more sick pay. We need an expansion of the welfare state to keep people in a position where they can do the not just the productive work of our society, but the reproductive work, right? The caring for one another, which is what we're all doing right now, right? Staying home, caring for one another. And that just doesn't count in most measures of the economy, right? Staying home doesn't count. Staying home is not productive in the way that people ordinarily think about the economy. And the system of kind of neoliberal economics that we've been given is one that systematically exploits the kind of care that we give for one another that's unpaid and that doesn't provide us with the resources that we need to kind of reproduce ourselves as a society. So we need those resources. We also need to roll back the carceral state, right? That is spending extraordinary sums and putting people in extraordinary grave danger, even in ordinary times, right? And providing us with none of the things that we really need to be able to address the underlying causes of things like crime in our society. So all of those pieces together, along with a recognition that, in fact, the economy is something that we build it together, and we need to build an economy that is worthy of the society that we want to live in, rather than one that treats people as disposable and that kind of exploits our planet and also our forms of care in the way that this one does today.
And finally, Greg Gonsalves, where does Medicare for All fit into this picture? How do you see it saving the lives of not only the most vulnerable, but of everyone?
So it's interesting. There's a piece in the Times today by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman from Berkeley that talk about COVID care for all. And I think I think the neologism is interesting because this is what has brought us to this brink. The failure of care in the United States, which is not recapitulated anywhere else in the industrialized world, has led us to a point where depends on who you are, whether you're going to get sick or whether you're going to get well, whether you're going to get infected with coronavirus or you're not going to get infected with the coronavirus. So unless we take care of each other from coast to coast, from north to south, east to west, we're going to be vulnerable we are all as vulnerable as the most vulnerable person in our society. And so unless undocumented immigrants, unless the incarcerated, unless the homeless are brought into the circle of care with health care universally accessible across the United States, there will always be somebody who's going to get sick, who could be the spark that sets off the next epidemic.
Greg Gonsalves and Amy Kapczynski, there's so much more to talk about. We will link to your pieces, both at Yale University. Greg Gonsalves is an epidemiologist at the Yale School of Public Health. They are co-directors of the Global Health Justice Partnership. When we come back, we look at how more than 100,000 homeless people from New York to Los Angeles to Oakland are at great risk as this pandemic spreads. When political leaders say shelter at home, what about when you don't have a home? Stay with us. Ojitos Verdes, Little Green Eyes, performed via video conference by Mariachi Escandon of Roma Middle School on the border town of Roma, Texas, in the midst of this pandemic. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States, New York City. Here in New York State, the death toll has surpassed 1,000 with more than 60,000 cases. And of course, that is a serious underestimate because of the lack of access we have to tests. In New York City, which accounts for more than half the state's cases, sirens can be heard wailing around the clock as New York scrambles to treat the growing number of critically ill patients. But as New Yorkers and people around the world are told to stay at home to prevent the spread of the virus, tens of thousands of unhoused people here in New York City shelters and on the streets have been left with no way to safely shelter in place. The virus is also spreading through the city's shelter system, where at least 70 cases have been reported in 45 shelters. 2 people have died. The news outlet The City reported Saturday 4 unsheltered, unhoused people have also tested positive for COVID. 3 are still hospitalized. Advocates for the unhoused say these numbers will get far worse if the city continues to fail to provide adequate bathrooms, public sanitation stations, proper shelter for homeless New Yorkers living on the street. Democracy Now! Reached Charmel Lucas, a member of Picture the Homeless, who's lived in the shelter system for 5 years, reached her on the phone last week. She expressed concern about unsheltered homeless people left on the streets amidst this pandemic.
The bathroom situation. Now, Starbucks was a big hub for homeless people to use the bathroom. So how are they washing their hands? The mall is closed. No bathroom. And there's a 24-hour bread and butter, but they're not letting people use the bathroom. So how is people supposed to wash their hands?
Meanwhile, those living in New York's packed shelter system say it's too crowded to allow for safe social distancing. This is Bernard Ward, who was living in a New York City shelter in downtown Brooklyn till last week. We reached him on the phone.
When the virus first hit, and people are always requesting for gloves and masks, and they said that we are not able to, it wasn't in their budget. I said, it wasn't in your budget? That didn't make no sense. All right, this is an epidemic. The maintenance personnel wasn't there. I've been cleaning up the dining area, the hallway, my dormitory, myself. It was 20 or more people in the dining area, closed up together with no protection, serving meals that wasn't, they didn't cover it. It was ridiculous.
All the while, New York City is continuing to break up homeless encampments despite the recommendation of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio said Sunday residents who don't adhere to strict social distancing rules can be fined up to $500, a rule that advocates warn will disproportionately affect unhoused people. For more, we're going to Kiana Davis, advocate, policy analyst with Safety Net Project at the Urban Justice Center. Kiana, welcome to Democracy Now! Lay out the issue here in New York, and then we'll go to L.A. and to Oakland.
Sure. Here in New York, what we're really seeing is the city continue to disregard and deprioritize the needs of people both living on the street and in our shelter system. We know that there are enough vacant spaces in the city, both hotels and apartments, where the city could be housing people. We know that folks on the street are continuing to be heavily policed. The city relies on the police force to manage and monitor homeless folks instead of offering actual services in the way of housing or bathrooms or hand washing stations, or even basic supplies and necessities for people on the street. We've seen the police continue to conduct street sweeps of homeless folks who are on the street, despite CDC and HUD guidance advising cities that that is not what they should be doing, that that is a risk to further spreading coronavirus and COVID-19. We know, as you heard from Bernard, that in the shelters there are inadequate cleanings happening, lack of basic sanitation supplies, a lack of ability to social distance. And as you mentioned, just this weekend, the mayor announced that they're now going to start fining people for not complying with social distancing rules when people who do not have a home, who are on the street or in congregate settings, do not have a way to socially distance.
So talk about what your demands are now. And how many people are we talking about in New York City?
Yes, so we know that there are over 17,000 adults in shelter, many of whom, single adults in shelter, many of whom are in these congregate setting, dorm-like shelter spaces, and about 3,500, a little more than 3,500 folks on the street as an estimate. So our demands, what we are prioritizing at this point is that the city should be using vacant hotels to ensure the safety for people who are on the street and who are in the shelter. We know that there are over 100,000 vacant hotel units right now in New York City that could be being used to offer isolation spaces to people who want that. We also, of course, always want to tie it to a longer demand to house the homeless people, homeless folks in our city now. Everyone who needs a home should be able to access one. We know that there is a huge vacant housing stock in our city that could be being offered to folks on the street and in shelters, which would allow folks to, of course, socially distance, self-quarantine, take care of themselves. We know that housing is healthcare. We also are demanding increased services for people on the street and in shelters. So some of the things I mentioned, like increasing hand washing stations, having more access to drop-in spaces for homeless folks, increasing distancing in shelters and cleaning in shelters. Another important demand is, of course, around policing. We believe that there should not be ongoing policing that targets homeless people, such as the street sweeps, such as fining people who are for socially distancing, when we know that that will inevitably directly target homeless folks who are on the street who do not have a place to go. And the last one is access to food and access to healthcare. About a third of food pantries in New York City have had to shutter their doors as a result of COVID-19. We want to make sure that people have access to food that is both accessible and meets their needs and accommodates whatever dietary restrictions, as well as access to healthcare.
Kiana, we're going to certainly continue to cover this issue. I want to thank you for being with us, Kiana Davis of the Urban Justice Center here in New York City. We're going to move on to Oakland and L.A., but I want to end with this New York comment of Charmel Lucas, who's been in the city shelter system for 5 years.
Our messages was always housing, not shelters. Housing, not shelters. And that's when a picture of the home is biggest message. Housing, not a shelter. So now you have all these people in these shelters for all these years, and now you got a pandemic, and they don't have their own apartment to lock down, cook food. So what is the city going to do differently after we get through this? What are they going to do differently for people that's in the shelter? You're going to get them into the apartments faster before another pandemic happens? What are y'all going to do? What is the plan for the next time? What's the plan?
What's the plan? Asked Charmel Lucas, who's been in the New York City shelter system for 5 years. Special thanks to Democracy Now's Libby Rainey. We turn now to California, where the number of cases has passed 6,000 with 132 COVID-19 deaths. The entire state has been ordered to shelter in place as California braces for a surge in cases, but more than 100,000 people are still living on the streets. A recent study estimates nearly 2,600 unhoused people will need to be hospitalized for the virus in LA alone, and nearly 1,000 will need intensive care. Governor Newsom has pledged thousands of hotel rooms for homeless people. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti said that he will open recreational centers to shelter the unhoused, and San Francisco is looking to convert churches and schools into shelters. But calls are growing for the state to use vacant homes to shelter the unhoused and employ other more drastic measures to protect people without homes. For more, we're going to Oakland, to Carol Fife, the director of the Oakland Office for Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, key organizer in the Moms for Housing movement. Earlier this year, when unhoused mothers occupied a vacant Oakland house until they were eventually able to win its sale. In a minute, we will also go to a mom in Los Angeles who has joined a new movement to occupy empty houses. Carol Fife, we begin with you in California. Lay out the issue in Oakland right now. The moms movement that we covered so extensively has taken on new urgent meaning right now when people are trying to shelter at home if they had one.
Correct. And thank you for the coverage, the intensive coverage that you all did. And just like the speaker from New York said, the situation in Oakland, California is exactly the same. There are still vacant properties that are going unlived in, and people still are living on the streets. Mothers and children are still living on the streets. Mom's house is still vacant. And we have a pandemic that is supposed to, the governor has said that we have to shelter in place, but if you don't have a place to shelter in, then you can't do that. And it really puts everyone in jeopardy. So if they're as serious as they say they are, they will immediately open up these hotels, open up spaces. There's still luxury units all over the city of Oakland that have huge vacancy rates. And we need to get people in them for the sake of everyone, for the sake of every single resident in our city.
I want to bring in, I want to go to Los Angeles. We're joined by Martha Escudero, who is a mother of two and Reclaiming Our Homes member. She was the first to reclaim an empty house owned by California earlier this month. If you can start off by talking about the group of unhoused mothers, elders, and families that are occupying 13 vacant homes to stay safe during the pandemic, Martha.
Hello, Amy Goodman. Thank you so much for this coverage. Yes, we're part of a group called Reclaiming Our Homes. I myself is a mother of two, Victoria and Mesli. They're 10 and 8 years old. We became aware of these houses being empty. There's 40 in El Sereno where I'm at, and counting Alhambra and South Pasadena, there's about 200 that are owned by the California state and are still sitting vacant while we're in a crisis. The whole state of California rent has gone so high in these last few years that it's become Skid Row. And it's really immoral for the state to be hoarding these empty houses while there's so many people on the streets, especially during this pandemic. So we feel that it's really important for the most vulnerable people to be able to be housed and be able to keep up their hygiene so that we don't spread the virus. So we're asking the governor to have all these vacant homes open immediately to be housed by the most vulnerable, the elderly, the ones that are chronically ill. And we believe that housing is a human right and it should be affordable and equitable for everybody. And if the government's not working fast enough, it comes to the power of the people to be able to love and protect each other and find these solutions for a government that's not doing its job.
Can you talk, Martha, about the city's response, of Mayor Garcetti's response to your whole movement? You're speaking to us from one of the houses that your group is occupying, from where you're living. He announced Los Angeles would use rec centers to shelter the unhoused, and Governor Newsom has announced the state will use hotels. What are you saying?
Regarding the Caltrans homes, I know the mayor has no jurisdiction. However, there's also county-owned, city-owned, and the school district owns a lot of vacant homes that are livable, that are ready. These homes, for example, a lot of the people are saying they were not properly taken care of. They had minor issues, some of them, and we were able to fix them. We, the people, the community, of reclaiming our homes. If the government could do the same, they've been hoarding these for like 30 years, 20 years. They need to act faster, especially during this pandemic. This is immoral and unjust to have. They want us dead. You know, they're not doing enough. So we need to take that power within our own hands. We're forced to do that.
Carol Fife in Oakland, we just did a segment on health justice and what that looks like in a pandemic. Can you talk about the issue of racial justice in this pandemic and unhoused people finding safe spaces to be in, not to infect themselves, their families, and the overall community?
Well, housing is health. It's foundational to health. And without it, you can't actually have the things that you need in order to thrive, in order to live. And it's a death sentence in Oakland for Oakland's unsheltered population and for our seniors and for the people who don't have access to the resources that our mutual aid organizations have been providing. Our hospitals are overstaffed, are just running over. They haven't seen the whole the curve actually hit right now. They haven't seen an onslaught of the patients that they will probably get over the next few days or next few weeks, but they're not prepared. None of us were prepared for this. And just like our family down in LA said, if the government is not doing what they need to do, then we will be forced to do it ourselves. And so it runs along racial lines like every other issue in our country, that it impacts Black folks and brown folks the most. Right now, our population of homeless folks in Oakland is 70%. So that means that if you're unsheltered and it's predominantly Black, then it's a death sentence for you. There are people on the streets that are frightened that their lives are going to end because no one cares about them.
And Carol, can you talk about Oakland just passing a 2-month freeze on evictions? And also for those who've lost their jobs in this $2 trillion bill and saying that Americans are going to get a check in the mail. How do people who are unhoused get a check in the mail?
You don't. It's a farce. It's a farce. And it is designed to make it appear that our government is doing something. But that's still because of community pressure of groups like ACE Action and Protect Oakland Renters, the group that worked together with our city council member, Nikki Fortunato Bass, to pass this moratorium, which is stronger than any other moratorium in our region, in the state, that it was because of community pressure that these things happened. And that is unfortunate. And the situations we're living in right now, it really is life or death for so many people and marginalized people.
Carol
we
Fife,
have to do better.
I want to thank you so much for being with us. Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, speaking to us from her home to keep the community safe and stop community spread. And Martha Escondero, mother of 2 and Reclaiming Our Homes member, speaking from the first Reclaiming Our Homes house, speaking to us again from home to protect the whole community. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warmnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura, Maria Studio, Adriano Contreras, Maria Terracena, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman.